Welcome to 3 Degrees' virtual event where we'll be exploring CARB's newly proposed amendments to the LCFS. I would estimate the session to last approximately 30 minutes, but I would encourage everyone to use the Q&A feature on Zoom to ask your questions throughout the event. We will be answering those at the end of the presentation. To kick things off, I would like to introduce everyone to our presenters today. First, Helen Kipp is a senior associate on our regulatory affairs team, and Dave Mayer is the director of our transportation markets team. Looking at our agenda today, we're going to start with a brief introduction to 3 Degrees, followed by a short history of CARB, look at the new rule package, and end with a Q&A. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dave. Dave?
Thanks, Daniel, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for taking the time to join us this morning. I know the proposed rules were highly anticipated, and so looking forward to diving into what CARB has proposed with you all. So before we get to that, I just want to give a little bit of an introduction to 3 Degrees for everyone. Some of you are probably relatively familiar with us, but for some of you, this might be your first introduction. So just to level set on who 3 Degrees is. 3 Degrees is a mission-oriented company focused on taking urgent action on climate change. And that is reflected in our mission, reflected in the fact that we are a B Corp, and we are really focused on helping other companies develop their decarbonization strategies and then helping them meet those. Some ways in which we do that is we look at each company's emissions, so scopes 1, scopes 2, and 3, and help identify those emissions and then come up with strategies for reducing those. As you may know, 3 Degrees' primary focus is in the environmental commodity space, so things like renewable energy certificates, increasingly carbon credits, renewable natural gas, things like that. But also, as we'll talk about today, on the transportation side of things, things like LCFS credits. In addition, we have some consulting practice that really helps folks, once these emission scopes are identified, dig into what's driving those emissions and come up with strategies for reducing them. And that may take the form of things like PPAs, supply chain interventions, things like that. As we focus specifically on the transportation space, 3 Degrees has a strong history in this space. As I mentioned, we're really focused on helping our partners take advantage of the incentive value represented by clean fuel standard programs like California's low carbon fuel standard. And some of the just kind of stats, I guess, to know about us. To date, we have over 140,000 credits that have been generated, over 10,000 individual pieces of fueling supply equipment. And as I mentioned, we have a long history in this market, and we were actually had some of the first credits issued under AB 32 as related to some of our work with digesters and folks in that space. I should note that while the conversation today will focus on California and the proposed rules there, we are active in all clean fuel standard jurisdictions. So California, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and the Canada Federal Program. And so we'd be happy to chat with folks about any of those programs as appropriate. So with a little bit of background on 3 degrees, we'll take a quick look at some history as it relates to the low carbon fuel standard and a little bit of an overview of the program. So just to level set with everybody, just to make sure we're all on the same page. The intent of clean fuel standard programs generally, and the LCFS in particular, is to be a market-based technology neutral policy, right? So the idea is we're trying to achieve certain carbon intensity reductions under the program, and basically any source of emissions reductions is valuable. So what the program does is it sets carbon intensity targets that decline over time. The current target is a 20% carbon intensity reduction by 2030. And as we'll talk about more in the overview of the new rules, one of the main focuses of this rulemaking session for CARB is increasing the stringency of the program and also defining targets out into the future. So you can see that kind of teal line indicates the new proposed targets as compared to the orange line, which shows what the current program, where the current program is headed. And it's worth noting that this applies to, basically any transportation fuel in California. And just to kind of level set on where we are from a market perspective, as I'm sure most of you are aware, the LCFS market has come down quite a bit. Especially as we compare it to where it was a couple of years ago, prices are much lower. And it's worth noting that prices came down about 15% in the immediate aftermath of the release of the proposed rule, which suggests that market participants think that, at least in the short term, the new targets that CARB has set are going to be relatively easy to achieve. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that is. But prices currently are in the $55 to $60 range for prompt LCFS credits. So with that, a little bit of background on 3 degrees, and a little bit of background on the program, I'd like to turn it over to Helen to walk us through some of the details as to what's actually in the new rule package.
Thanks, Dave. Hi, everyone. So the rule package here is a culmination of an informal rulemaking process that's been going on for a few years now, where CARB has been holding workshops and soliciting public feedback on a lot of different proposals. So a lot of the major changes in the rule package are reflecting things that we have seen from CARB before in some form or another. So there weren't too many big surprises, I think. The main thing to note is the comment period right now is began on January 5th, and it runs through February 20th. So CARB is accepting written feedback until then. And then there will be a board meeting March 21st, which is the earliest date that the board could vote to adopt the proposed regulation. But if there are changes or anything like that, it might trigger another comment period. And then here you can see kind of a list of the draft amendments that we're going to go through now. All right, so the CI score, this is something that Dave kind of started mentioning earlier, but the new proposed CI score reduction is 30% by 2030, and they've essentially extended the program out through 2045 with a 90% reduction target. That is also still based on a 2010 baseline, which is what the previous target was based on. And the question now is sort of whether this is stringent enough to incentivize near-term investments so that we can meet that 90% target, because obviously a very steep target to hit, even though it is quite far out. And then another thing to note is that CARB suggested a step down adjustment. So in 2025, there would be a full 5% increase in stringency, which would be an 18.75% reduction from the 2018 regulation, which is the last time that the regulation was majorly updated. Okay, next is the auto acceleration mechanism. So the design of the AAM is something that CARB really requested feedback on during the informal process in their workshops I was talking about earlier. And we think they've landed on something more or less workable here. So basically, if these three conditions are present, which is first, whether the credit bank is at least 3 times the average quarterly deficit generation for the prior year, and if credit generation in the prior year exceeds deficit generation, and the AAM was not triggered in the prior year, then the following CI target for the next year will be advanced to basically the subsequent year's target. So it kind of just speeds things up. And according to CARB, this is kind of the main mechanism that's expected to decrease market volatility and increase market confidence, in their words.
Yeah, just for a little bit more color here, maybe I think the intent of this mechanism, as proposed by CARB, is to correct for some of what we've seen so far in the market. You know, in 2022, we exceeded the program target significantly by a couple of percentage points, and it appears that 2023 is on track for even more significant exceedance of the target. You know, the most recent data had what I think is the largest credit build in the program's history. So definitely continuing to overperform the targets. And so the idea of the auto acceleration mechanism is to try to correct for some of that, so that if we see the program continuing to overperform the targets that CARB has set, that there is a way to try to correct for that.
Thanks, Steve. All right, the next major set of changes has to do with the forklift crediting opportunity. So the first change here, which is changing the credit generating entity from the fleet owner to the fueling supply equipment owner. This is intended to align with other types of the sort of non-car equipment, electric vehicles that are in the program. It's generally the FSC that is the credit generating entity. The forklift crediting no longer depends on when the forklift was produced. And then the biggest change is probably this adjustment to the energy economy ratio. So for lower capacity forklifts, electric and hydrogen, CARB is proposing to cut the EER by 50%, which I think essentially cuts the crediting generation opportunity in half. And the last thing here is that they're no longer going to allow the estimation methodology according to the proposed rule. So all forklift charging has to be metered. And the reason they've given for that is to improve data accuracy and I think kind of make reporting easier on their end. Anything? There you go. All right, moving on to infrastructure crediting. So there has been an infrastructure crediting opportunity under the existing rule, but they're making some proposed changes to it. So credits will be awarded for the available capacity of installed hydrogen fueling stations and DC fast chargers. There's new eligibility for medium and heavy duty equipment. So this is in response to the fact that demand for this kind of infrastructure is currently somewhat low, but it's expected that we'll need a lot more of it in later years. as more fleets and trucks transition to alternative fuels. So the idea here is to incentivize construction of that infrastructure while it's the early days and before it's really necessary. And then as it becomes needed, it will be in place. And then CARB is also proposing to modify eligibility for light duty infrastructure crediting, which it will come into play after 2025. The light duty infrastructure will have to be in a low income or disadvantaged community. And then they've also added some limits to the number of chargers and capacity requirements. All right, so this is a tweak that CARB has proposed to redefine multifamily charging as a non-residential opportunity. So the owner of chargers at multifamily residences, which are defined as residences with more than 4 or at least 4 condos and at least 3 apartments, will be able to generate non-residential credits for their charging. The idea here is that the multifamily sector needs more investment in these charging facilities, and it can also encourage things like car sharing. So CARB pointed to that as a reason for reclassifying this to promote some more multifamily chargers. Okay, third-party verification requirements. So this is sort of a big one for electric fueling, the electricity fueling type, or charging type rather. Quarterly fuel transactions for hydrogen and electricity fueling for these types of technologies now have to be verified. So this is a new requirement. Sites with multiple fueling supply equipment can come up with a sampling plan with their third-party verifier so that they don't have to necessarily look at every single piece of equipment, but that's sort of a thing that you have to come up with your verifier. And then there's an opportunity to undergo a less intensive verification for 2 years following a full verification if your verification is accepted. So I don't know if there's anything else you want to add here, Dave, but that's
I would just say that it sounds like CARB is still trying to figure out how this would be implemented in practice for EVs. What's currently in place for verification was implemented with an eye toward biofuel production, so things like ethanol facilities, renewable diesel facilities, things like that. And so there are requirements for site visits, and one of the things that we're certainly going to comment on, and CARB is eliciting feedback on, is essentially how that site visit requirement should be implemented for electric vehicles. As I mentioned kind of in the opening, 3 degrees in our capacity as a designated reporting entity, we have over 10,000 pieces of individual fueling supply equipment, primarily EV chargers, registered under the program. And it's just not feasible, right, for somebody to visit all of those chargers. And so that's one area that we're going to provide some comment on, is making sure that the expectations for site visits, in particular sampling plans, are reasonable for the EV industry.
Okay. All right, so the last major proposed change that we're going to talk about is changes to avoided methane projects. So biomethane is an important fuel, especially for difficult to electrify sectors. And collectively, it's been the biggest credit generator after renewable diesel and electricity through the course of the program. One thing that CARB is proposing is to change the deliverability requirements for book and claim of biomethane. So pipeline injected biomethane projects that begin construction in or after 2030, the fuel has to be injected into a pipeline that flows towards California at least 50% of the year. And the idea behind that is that CARB wants to make sure they're incentivizing methane emissions reductions that benefit California and not other regions or states, but this is aligning with the RPS and the SB 1440 requirements that are existing. And SB 1440 is the utility biomethane procurement target law. The next change is the avoided methane phase out. So pathways for certain avoided methane crediting projects are going to be phased out beginning in 2041 or 2046, depending on the exact pathway. And that just applies to projects that begin construction in 2030 or later. And then finally, the RNG projects that have pathways certified before 2030 are going to be still eligible for 3 consecutive 10-year crediting periods. So I think CARB's kind of aiming to have a soft landing for biomethane projects by making these phase outs kind of on the long term. But yeah, biomethane is still a very important fuel in the program.
And I think it just may be worth calling out that note at the bottom of the slide that these changes apply to RNG specifically and do not apply to biogas to electricity projects. So this is really focused on the RNG side of biomethane.
Okay, and then we have listed here just a few other more minor changes, or just changes that we didn't think warranted a full discussion. But the one of the changes that we've been anticipating is that fossil jet fuel for flights within California is now going to generate deficits beginning in 2028. So fossil jet or jet fuel, alternative jet fuel is an opt-in credit generator right now, but it's going to be obligated beginning in a few years. Also, indirect hydrogen accounting is now allowed for hydrogen that is injected into a pipeline that's physically connected to California. And fossil-based hydrogen cannot generate credits unless it's paired with CCS, carbon capture. And also PPAs can be used to match lower CI electricity and lower the carbon intensity of hydrogen production in processing and production.
And I'll maybe just, I might just pause on that point in particular, just to draw out that distinction a little bit. So historically, CARB's view has been that renewable energy attributes, whether we're talking about RECs or we're talking about RNG, renewable thermal certificates, things like that, those can be used to offset emissions associated with feedstock energy, but not associated with process energy. So if we think about green hydrogen, for example, historically, you could use RECs to match with the electricity supplied to the electrolyzer to claim that that electricity is zero carbon intensity. But any process energy, things like compression, pumping, liquefaction, things like that, you could not use RECs to offset the emissions associated with that electricity. So you would have to, unless you had physical, direct, on-site renewable energy supply, you would have to claim the emissions from that at grid electricity emissions levels. And what this proposed change is allowing is saying that basically you can use those renewable energy attributes to offset process energy as well, as long as it's, you know, under the guise of a PPA. So you still wouldn't be able to use unbundled RECs that are just purchased from the market to accomplish that. But you would be able to enter into a PPA and use the RECs associated with that to offset the process energy.
It's an important point. Thank you. All right, so last two changes here are changes to the crop-based feedstock sustainability requirements. So CARB is implementing more stringent tracking and attestations around crop-based feedstocks that are used to produce fuels, and palm-based fuels are no longer allowed to generate credits. So it's been explicitly excluded from the program. And then finally here, the electric transport refrigeration unit has been changed so that the FSC is no longer defined as the eTrue unit, but it's the location where the electricity is dispensed. So the fueling facility owner is the credit generator now. I think that kind of aligns with the other like the changes to the FSE for other technologies. That is all I had.
All right, great. Thanks, Helen. So now we'll move into to Q&A. Again, you know, please feel free to enter questions in the Q&A panel, or raise your hand if you'd like to ask your question directly. So I see we do have one hand raised. So Caroline, I will go ahead and unmute you. Actually, I think I need you to unmute now, Caroline.
Oh, hi. Sorry, I didn't realize you were talking about me. Yeah, it's about the unbundled RECs. I wondered if they had considered the use of 24/7 RECs, because the IRA guidelines do allow you to use you know, 24/7 RECs from 2028. So I wondered if that was a consideration at all for hydrogen.
Yeah, good question. And maybe just to elaborate on that point a little bit for folks. So the Inflation Reduction Act, the proposed guidance from the Treasury on accessing the production tax credit for renewable hydrogen, they've developed this kind of three-pillar approach to basically demonstrate that or to qualify the renewable energy for use under the production tax credit. And one of the pillars is this idea of kind of temporal matching. And so the idea is that starting in 2028, any unbundled RECs that are used to match with hydrogen production will need to be matched on an hourly basis. So the short answer, Caroline, is I'm not sure what CARB considered there in terms of the requirements for REC matching. You know, to date, when we think about that process energy question versus feedstock energy question, RECs in general under the LCFS can be matched for 3 quarters. So if you're reporting for, Q4 activity, you can use RECs that were generated in Q2, Q3, or Q4. But renewable energy used to offset process energy needs to be matched on a monthly basis. So if you have on-site renewables that you're matching with process energy, CARB will essentially allow you to do that analysis, that true up monthly. But I don't remember seeing anything from CARB about moving to something more stringent. I don't know, Helen, if you've seen or heard anything about that.
No, I don't think they talked about that at all.
Okay. Thanks, Caroline, for the question. Looks like Shake has a question, so I am giving you permission to speak. And Shake, I think you need to unmute yourself.
Thanks, Dave. Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Yes. So my question is the LCFS credits from the EV chargers, and then it's the pathway for the solar. Suppose we're planning to have a large number of EV chargers installed, and then you also have a PV solar system in the same complex. So the standard LCFS credit is X, and then you have a solar pathway, you get X plus something. Do you know what those numbers are looking as of now?
Yeah, just using kind of round numbers, if you report EV charging activity using grid electricity, 1 megawatt hour, and we're talking about light duty vehicles here in particular, 1 megawatt hour of EV charging activity will generate about 0.8 LCFS credits. If you match that charging with renewable energy, that raises the credit generation to about 1.1 credits per megawatt hour. So you get about a 0.3 credit per megawatt hour effectively.
Okay, so what is the market rate now for the LCFS credit for the EV charger?
Yeah, LCFS credits right now are around $60. So that 0.3 bump would equate to what, about $18 worth.
$18 more. Okay. So one more thing. So we have a huge quantity of EV chargers. Not all of the electrical capacities will come from PV. A portion of it only. So I think only those quantity will qualify for the additional 0.3 credit.
Yeah, so maybe just to drill in on that a little bit. So there's a couple of things to think about there. So one, you can claim on-site renewable energy generation against EV charging. If you want to do that kind of directly, CARB requires a couple of things. One, the renewable energy source and the EV chargers have to be directly connected. And when I say directly connected, I mean effectively the renewable energy has to flow past the chargers before it hits the grid. So we've seen, as an example, one of our partners that we work with had solar panels on the roof of a building that those solar panels were tied into a distribution panel, the same distribution panel that the chargers were tied into. CARB did not consider that to be directly connected because the electricity could effectively flow from the panels to the grid instead of from the panels to the chargers. So that's one piece. The second piece is you can still use unbundled RECs to generate those incremental credits, even if you don't have sufficient renewable energy on site. So if you have, for example, 100 megawatt hours of on-site renewable generation in a month, and you have 200 megawatt hours of on-site charging, you can buy 100 RECs to kind of fill the difference between what's generated on site and what was used by your chargers.
And the LCFS response of 0.3 and 0.31.
So you're breaking up a little bit there, Sheikh, but I think what you're asking is does the 0.3 incremental credit value apply both to on-site renewables and to RECs? And the answer is yes.
Okay. So it's about RECs. But last bit, right? If the PV power generation does not directly flow into the EV chargers, but it can still qualify for that 0.3.
Yeah, so you're still breaking up, Sheikh. So I might ask you potentially to put a question in the chat. But I think what I'm hearing is if the chargers are not directly connected to the renewable energies, there's still a way to get that 0.3 incremental credit generation. The answer is yes. What you would do is you would register that renewable energy facility to generate RECs, and then you would use those RECs against the charging in the same way that you would use unbundled RECs.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for your questions. There's a question in the chat about for office buildings, if we're thinking about adding additional EV chargers to our existing system for employees, would it be preferable to do this in 2024 before the 2025 modified eligibility so the new chargers can generate credits? Good question. And to clarify, the change in eligibility that we were talking about relates to infrastructure crediting. It does not modify what we would consider to be the more conventional crediting approach, which is generating credits from actual fueling activity. So chargers in this example, chargers installed at an office building wouldn't be eligible for infrastructure crediting anyway, because one of the requirements for infrastructure crediting is that the chargers be available for public use. And so if you're installing them for use by your employees only, then that would not meet the definition of public use. So you will still be able to generate credits from the actual charging that takes place at the chargers, regardless of when those chargers are installed.
And just one other note, if you're looking at that infrastructure crediting opportunity, that's 2026 onwards. So it's for applications after 2025. Just clarify that.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification, Helen. And just to follow up, it looks like Sheikh had a follow-up question in the chat just to close that out. If the PV electrons are not directly flowing to EV chargers, will we still qualify for the additional 0.3 credits? And again, the answer is yes, as long as you register that renewable energy facility to generate RECs. So you would need to register it with Regis, get the RECs generated in Regis, and then match those RECs with your EV charging in the same way that you could do with unbundled RECs that you would buy from the market. And it looks like we have another hand raised, Noah. So I'm giving you the ability, and it looks like you're unmuted. So Noah, please take it away.
Hey, Dave, I just have quick questions based on the third bullet point, RNG credit timeline, it says RNG projects that are certified before January 1st, 2030 are eligible for up to 3 consecutive 10-year crediting periods. So does that mean that like a project that started in like 2015 or let's say 2012 will expire in 2042? Or does that mean that a project in 2029 can generate credits past the 2040 deadline?
I guess I would say both of those things are true. So if a project started up in 2012, one, hopefully it has renewed its crediting period because the first crediting period would have expired in 2022. And it would be eligible for 3 crediting periods. So that means it would be eligible to generate credits through 2042. And a project, to be clear, a project that has a pathway certified in 2029, so not necessarily starts up in 2029, but has a pathway certified in 2029, would also be eligible for 3 crediting periods, which means that they'd basically be able to generate credits through 2059.
Seriously. Okay. And then as for the deliverability requirements, that only applies to RNG, or does that also apply to hydrogen?
Helen, I might ask you to
Yeah.
take that.
Just biomethane, I believe.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think there is a tweak to deliverability requirements for RNG used in the production of hydrogen, but I don't remember off the top of my head what that tweak is. So that's something that we can follow up with you on.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. Another question in the chat: are there any incentives available for level 2 and level 3 chargers from air quality management districts, CalSTART, Cal EVIP? Short answer is yes. Long answer is there's a kind of a large number of overlapping incentives depending on the location of the charger, the utility territory you're in, the air quality management district you're in, things like that. So it's difficult to give kind of a one size fits all answer as to what incentives might be available, but in general, yes, there are incentives made available by different utilities, different air quality management districts, even different counties and cities for the installation of chargers. So it's really going to be pretty project specific as to what might be available. Looks like we have another hand raised from Tom. So Tom, I am giving you the floor.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks to the whole team at 3 Degrees for putting this on. This is really, really helpful. We saw the same things you did in the credit market after the ISOR release, and I know there's a lot of questions about whether what the agency's proposed is stringent enough. To the extent that it's not, and we think the market can do more, I wonder if you might have thoughts on maybe what staff missed in their own modeling that led them to think that their proposal is appropriate and 35% was not.
Yeah, my guess is so a couple of things. One, part of what CARB does when they look at different approaches is they are trying to solve for lowest cost. And so from that perspective, lower credit prices is actually better when they're doing that solve. So part of it might have been, you know, that that the low prices represented by higher credit generation with a 30% target in the near term might have actually looked better in their analysis. I think our perspective, and we're going to make comments to this effect, is that while that might be true, that, you know, compliance costs will be lower with a less aggressive target, what's really needed is earlier investment, because if you remember the shape of the chart that we showed, it's a much steeper curve between 2030 and 2040, and so meeting the reduction requirements in those years, and especially in 2045 when the target is a 90% reduction, is going to require investments now and in the next few years. And having lower credit prices disincentivizes those investments. So we're going to make some comments to that effect, basically saying, you know, we should be having a more stringent target in the near term. Even if that increases prices, that's going to give a signal to the market to make the investments required to meet the targets post 2030. I think the other thing, and without digging into the guts of the CATS model, which is what CARB uses for trying to figure out what the credit and deficit situation is going to be in each year, you know, they rely on things like MFAC, which is the emissions factor database that is put out by CARB for the inputs to their modeling. And my recollection is that the MFAC database has not been updated to account for things like Advanced Clean Cars 2 and the target of, you know, all zero emissions vehicle sales by 2035. So I think the last version of MFAC had EV sales topping out at something very low, like 12 or 15%, which obviously doesn't match current state, right? California is at like 25% light duty EV sales are zero emissions. And certainly doesn't match the ambitions of something like the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule. And so I think that they might be using outdated assumptions about what the fleet is going to look like, which would therefore impact their view of credit generation from zero emissions vehicles and deficit generation from internal combustion engine vehicles.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thanks, Dave. On that last point, I agree that it's at least a little unclear what their baseline assumptions are around electrification penetration, certainly in the medium heavy duty fleet. And even if they were like full up to date and using even like scoping plan data for the light duty side, we're seeing the EV market outpace some of those assumptions even as well. So at the very least, there's questions there, and I share some of those questions. So thanks. That's really, really helpful.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for the question. We've got a couple of questions in the Q&A. So one is, what are the requirements for flights to generate deficits? Flights to and from California, or all flights originated or landed in California? So it's specifically for intra-California flights. So flights that take off in and land in California. So things like, you know, LAX to SFO, or, you know, Sacramento to Ontario, things like that. Those flights would be covered, would generate deficits. Any flights into California from another location or out of California to another location would not be covered under that requirement. And then there's a question about when do you think LCFS prices will, if at all, rebound? Why have prices dropped despite somewhat better than expected proposed changes, specifically with respect to RNG? So I think a couple of pieces of that. So better than expected, I think depends on your view. So it is better than expected in terms of the ability for RNG facilities to generate credits, which is actually going to decrease prices, right? Higher credit generation in general is going to lead to lower prices. So it is better for the RNG facilities, worse for the market, I would say, as a whole from a credit price perspective. I think our understanding of why prices dropped was primarily related to timing. So there was some hope that the proposed rules would be targeted for to be implemented in the middle of this year. And CARB has been pretty clear that they're not going to come into effect until the beginning of next year, which means that we're going to have several more quarters of very significant credit generation, which means that the credit bank is going to be starting at a higher place when these new rules come into effect. So even if you believe that the new requirement is stringent enough, you're still going to have a lot more credits kind of sitting out in the market that will serve to kind of depress prices for a longer period. So I think that's the primary, what we've heard as being kind of the primary rationale for credit prices dropping. In terms of when credit prices will rebound, that really depends on your expectations as to when the bank is going to peak and start to get drawn down. Based on what we've seen from third-party analysts, our own modeling, what we've heard from other folks who have done modeling, sounds like that's not going to happen until sometime late this decade. And what we've seen is the market tends to anticipate inflection points about a year in advance. So if you think that, the credit bank is going to continue to build until, call it 2030, if we're just to use round numbers, then we would expect prices to start to significantly increase in, call it 2029. Now, the new dynamic there that hasn't been present in the past is new programs opening up, right? So Washington has opened up, Canada has opened up with similar programs. And so those are going to serve as potential sinks for certain fuels, in particular renewable diesel. We've already seen renewable diesel starting to move to, in particular, Oregon, as prices in California have declined, and that's starting to hit prices in Oregon as well, because they're basically in an excess credit situation now. So that dynamic will potentially change how prices unfold. But Washington and Oregon are pretty small transportation markets relative to California. I think combined, they're roughly 30% the size of California. Canada's market is about the same size as California's, but then you have considerations like RINs, right? You wouldn't get RINs if you sent the fuel to Canada. So it does take, a pretty significant pricing difference to start to draw fuels into that market. So kind of a long-winded answer to your question, but hopefully that gives you some additional color that you were looking for. All right, well, at this point, I don't see any additional questions in the Q&A. I don't see any hands raised, and we are coming up on the top of the hour. So I think that's probably a good point for us to stop. If you have any additional questions, or if you would like to follow up with us on opportunities that you're exploring, please feel free to reach out to our colleague John Summers. He was not able to attend the webinar this morning, as he's at a conference this week, but he is available for any follow-up questions that you may have. And thanks again for taking the time to join us this morning, and we look forward to hearing more from you all.